We may as well start. If people come in, they come in. Alright, so I'm Doug Greene. I am one of the volunteers here at the CME, the Center for Marxist Education. This is technically our second event of 2015. We just had a wonderful New Year's celebration 2 days ago. And this is part of the continuing Red Lecture history series, which I give mostly monthly, on various aspects of left-wing, socialist, communist, Marxist, whatnot history. And it is on the Poum. And before I start, I realized, probably should have realized going into it, that this is probably up there with Kronstadt in terms of the amount of polemics that get leveled against it. I will never actually speak on Kronstadt. But, that said, you know, it was in college, both undergrad and grad school, a topic that I was very much obsessed over. I read a lot, I wrote a lot. And although I hadn't written much on it since college, I read a lot more. So my views have actually changed in certain respects. And if you actually check the Facebook page, you can see an essay I wrote on the historiography of how different historians have looked at the war from different perspectives: liberal, conservative, official Communist Party, radicals such as Anarchist, Tratskyism, and whatnot. I actually don't consider my my views to actually fall under any of those rubrics, but there you go. So, the Poum, let's get started. The Poum, those who would. And to start off, for generations of leftists, the most recognizable images of the Spanish Civil War is from May 1937, and that comes from George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, of anarchists and Pumas workers defending the telephone exchange in Barcelona from the Communist Party. This image is said to represent the betrayal of Spain's libertarian communist revolution by the agents of Moscow. And in the debate since May 1937, a great deal of polemics has been exchanged on what went wrong and on the many what-ifs on how the revolution could have been won on the streets of Barcelona. And the basic picture which Orwell presents still holds for much of the writing related to the Spanish Civil War, including among non-leftists. Yet this picture is not so clear in hindsight. The truth is, any chance for a successful revolution in Spain was lost long before May 1937, and the blame for this is not to be laid actually on the feet of the Communist Party, but on the anarchists themselves for throwing away their chance at power. When the nationalists began their military coup to bring down the Republic, workers, peasants, and soldiers rose up in response not only to defend the Republic, but to make their own social revolution. And in Catalonia, the anarchist unions were the strongest left-wing political force, leading the successful resistance to the military rebellion. And once the nationalists were crushed in Catalonia, the anarchists were masters of the streets and power was in their hands. Yet the anarchists refused to take power, not really because they didn't know what to do with it, although that's true, but because they didn't want to be Bolsheviks and establish their own revolutionary dictatorship. The anarchist conception of revolution only involved abolishing the state and establishing libertarian communism. The anarchists hoped that their militia, fired by a revolutionary lane, would be enough to defeat Franco and defend the revolution. And despite their unbound heroism, the militia quickly proved themselves to be unable to win in the field. Yet the necessities of the Spanish Civil War, fighting against a determined and heavily armed adversary, precisely meant that a state was needed in order to reconstruct a regular centralized army, develop a central command to plan military strategy, coordinate resources, and plan production. And while the anarchists refused to take power, they wound up accepting the existence of the Republican state and its priorities for the war when they joined the government in September of 1936. And despite many anarchist criticism of the conduct of the war by the Republic, which did come to a head with the crisis in May 1937, the majority of their movement was not willing to break away and push aside the Republic. Although the anarchists accepted the end of communism, they neglected the means to get there: revolutionary dictatorship, ensuring their defeat in advance. This is not the only part of the story, though. There are others, in theory at least, who recognize that what the anarchists ignored: the need for the seizure of power. These were the brave and dedicated militants of the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, the Poum for the remainder of this talk, who fought alongside the anarchists. The Poum recognized that the militia would not win the war, but whereas the anarchists accepted the government line of a centralized army, the Poum, by contrast, had the idea of creating a revolutionary, centralized Red Army, combine the revolutionary lane of the masses with a centralized and disciplined, coordinated command that could potentially win. However, the Poum themselves had no chance to really implement these ideas. For one, the Poum had made a large number of strategic political mistakes before the war that left them isolated in Catalonia, such as not joining with the radicalizing socialist youth and not orienting their union work towards the anarchists in order to influence them. During the war, the Poum leadership did not make a bid for power, but supported, with their own reservations, the government of the Popular Front. This no doubt served to disorient their supporters and potential allies. Ultimately, even if the Poum had wanted to implement their policies in Spain, they could not, since they were largely isolated in Catalonia, and even there they were dwarfed by the larger organizations of both the anarchists and the communists. In the end, the only party that possessed a viable strategy to win the war and the will to carry it out was actually the Communist Party. The Communist Party did forswear their revolutionary aims in the pursuit of victory against the nationalists. This meant that the party became the main supporter of the efforts of the government to reconstitute its authority, develop a centralized army, and secure Soviet and Western military aid. Yet the communists believed that by supporting and rolling back the revolution, that they could make the Republic appear reasonable in the eyes of the Western bourgeois democracies of principally France and Britain, and gain military and political support, along with advanced Soviet foreign policy aims for collective security. The communist strategy in regards to the Western powers was flawed in that no matter how non-revolutionary the Republic may have appeared, France and Britain had no desire to see the Republic win, but their ruling classes were only too willing to collude with Franco's backers. Yet the communists correctly saw the need for a centralized army that was needed to win the war, and without centralizing its armed forces and reconstituting the state power and securing Soviet aid, the Republic would arguably have lost much sooner. So in light of the fact that no political force was able to put forward or implement an alternative strategy, it was the Communist Party, however non-revolutionary it may have been, that possessed the only realistic option. Thus, the central strategy of the Spanish Civil War is that the anarchists possessed the numbers and the organizational muscle for power, but refused to take it. The Poum had a program for waging revolutionary war, but lacked the mass influence, allies, and leadership necessary to win. Ultimately, those who would couldn't, and those who could wouldn't. Finally got that right. Now going to the background of Spain, unlike many countries in Europe, Spain was not a fully developed capitalist society, but had a powerful landowning class and a monarchy, and it was burdened with a small bourgeoisie and a large peasantry. And since capitalist development was delayed in Spain, its working class was small but highly combated and influenced heavily by anarchist and syndicalist ideas. They did have a small socialist party, very evolutionary, gradualist, and which did not actually repudiate the monarchy until 1914, and they've since come around to accept the monarchy once again. And this meant that many militant workers in Spain were not actually backing the Socialist Party. Rather, they were, as I said, anarchists. And in 1910, an anarchist Federation of Labor, the National Confederation of Labor, the CNT, was formed, influenced by various syndicalist ideas from Spain, and they pursued a revolutionary strategy of strikes, riots, and sabotage that they hoped would lead to the creation of the new society. And over the next several years, the CNT expanded rapidly, engaging in struggles on behalf of workers. And with the outbreak of World War I, which Spain was actually neutral, the CNT socialists and bourgeois republicans actually made a bid for power. And at this point, because the situation in Spain was so desperate, even though Spain was neutral, its ruling class was getting rich off of supplying weapons and materiel to the various allied powers. And this meant their profits went up while wages and conditions for workers went down. And this eventually led in 1917 to an abortive coup d'etat. And through about 1920, there was heavy strikes, there was shootings, murders, and the government did send in their police forces to crush those strikes, and they did attempt to assassinate union leaders. These were, at one point, I believe they called the 3 years of Bolshevism between 1918 through 1920. All this unrest in Spain, coupled with their own military losses in their colony of Morocco, actually led to a crisis of the monarchy and led to calls for new order. And this led to a military coup in 1923 when an officer named Miguel Primo de Rivera took power, and he promised to modernize Spain to deal with the agrarian crisis and the workers' crisis. And he actually was able to get the cooperation from the socialist-led union, the UGT. Well, the anarchists were actually outlawed, and he hoped to, but his industrialization program, his modernization program, was half-hearted, poorly planned, and he eventually managed to alienate pretty much everybody, whether the bourgeoisie, the landowners, the socialists, the anarchists. And by 1931, after a major general strike and a plebiscite, the monarchy comes down and the Second Republic was proclaimed. Now, the period from Spain to from the First World War to the founding of the Second Republic not only saw the explosion of working class militancy, but significant changes on the far left. Only two of which will concern us here: the development of the Spanish Communist Party and changes within the Anarchist movement. The Russian Revolution influenced the section of Spanish radicals, both in the socialist and the anarchist movements, to follow the Bolshevik example, seeing it as a wave of the future. And within the Socialist Party, there was actually a vote, but most to join the Third International. The communists lost, and the losers formed their own Communist Party, which eventually would merge with another section to form the PCE, the Spanish Communist Party. Now, within the anarchist movements, there was a different change. Anarchists had seen even though the Bolshevik years of 1917 through 20 had shown the potentials for mass action within the working class of Spain, they showed its limitations, particularly with regard to political organization. The Catalan anarchist Joaquin Marin concluded the labor movement has been characterized in these last years by dispersed, atomistic, and undisciplined activity. What happened was very sad. When one of the great capitals was at white heat, the rest were cold. All struggles were isolated combats impregnated with an excess of localism that made a unified revolutionary movement impossible. Now, Joaquin Marin, he was trained as a school, actually originally trained for the priesthood, became a school teacher. He moved into journalism, and he eventually joined the CNT. And he worked as a union educator, militant for the union, in Barcelona principally. And like many anarchists at this time, he looked to the example of the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Party. And he actually, during a meeting of trade unions in Moscow in 1921, he was there, and he came to the conclusion through his own experience, through his own reading, that what was essential for a more centralized struggle were reliance on professional revolutionaries, while insisting that a syndicalist morality must be based on the concept of collective violence. He was advocating a need for a revolutionary party to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, and his views were not accepted by the CNT, and the Spanish anarcho-syndicalists ultimately rejected any affiliation with the Comintern. Another CNT member who embraced Bolshevism was more famous. It was Andres Nin, who was born in 1892. He was also a school teacher and a journalist, and actually what he would later be well known as a linguist and a translator. And he was also an important figure in the CNT. At one point, he actually led the CNT. And Nin actually had at one point the CNT affiliate to the Comintern, which eventually was they unaffiliated with the Comintern. And essentially these two men have joined the Communist Party of Spain. For Nin, he actually would remain active in the Comintern's trade union organization, the Profintern. He would rise to assistant secretary, and he would actually be principally active within the Soviet Communist Party from 1923 onward. And he married a Russian woman. He had 2 children. In 1926, after briefly backing Nikolai Bukharin, he sided with Leon Trotsky, which eventually caused him to be removed from political activity both within the Spanish Party and in the Soviet Communist Party. And he eventually returned to Spain in 1930, where he joined a small Trotskyist group that he would form, the Communist Opposition of Spain, who we'll return to later. Now, Marin actually returned to Spain to do political work for the Communist Party. And he was actually imprisoned at various points, and he was making a lot of effort, particularly in Catalonia, to get the CNT to affiliate with the Communist Party, to build up communist influence within their unions. And he actually at one point had like their own little faction, the Revolutionary Syndicalist Committees. These were expelled, didn't actually work. And through various power struggles, through factional influence within the Communist Party, Marin would be removed from leadership, brought back into leadership, and Marin had a strong base of support within this Catalonian federation. And what eventually led to a break between Marin and the Communist Party was he found himself opposed to the Comintern line, which had been developed after the 6th Comintern Congress of 1928. that the post-dictatorship regime would be a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Marin actually argued for a federal democratic republic, which put him to the right of the Comintern, which is why he's classically associated with the right opposition. His line was rejected, and he continued activity through 1930 within his faction, but he was denounced for his rightist deviations. And in 1931, in July, he left the PCE, taking his faction in Barcelona and Catalonia with him. And this meant that effectively there was no actual communist party in Catalonia. Marin had it. And he formed, in 1931, the Workers' and Peasants' Bloc, the BOC, which had about 700 members. And these two men, Marin and Nin, if you didn't already know, are the central leaders of the coup. Now, let's move on to the changes within the anarchist movement. Following the communist splits within the anarchist movement in the 20s, the movement reaffirmed its anarchist principles. It affiliated to the International Workingmen's Association, which is an anarchist international. And following the establishment of the dictatorship in 1923, it was outlawed, its papers banned, and its militants were thrown in jail. And this led to actually revealing more fissures within the anarchist movement. On the one hand, you had people like Durruti and other anarchists, call them Robin Hoods or what you want, who would attack military bases. They carried out political assassinations. They planned for general strikes to bring down the dictatorship. But you also had other factions within the CNT, those who wanted its membership to go in a more political direction of dealing with the state. Different regional factions or regional components within the CNT had different relationships, so there was not a monolithic movement. There were those who, within the CNT, who saw the value of elaborating a parliamentary political strategy to mobilize their members to get benefits from the state. And the very fact that there were anarchists who sought to steer the movement into engagement with the state or the parliamentary socialists meant that the political leadership of the CNT was desperately needed. So in 1927, this led to the foundation of the Iberian Anarchist Federation, the FAI, to defend anarchist orthodoxy within the CNT. And the FAI was a loose network of individuals, not a centralized vanguard, which would ultimately be its weakness. However, the foundation of the FAI did not end the dispute within the CNT between the reformers and the orthodox, where the issues would grow in importance with the foundation of the Republic. Purists demanded the establishment of libertarian communism, and during the Republic they actually staged major uprisings in 1932. But there were CNT militants who argued that the anarchists should abandon their anti-parliamentarism and engage in political action to advance their interests. Failure to do so, they argued, only hurt the CNT members and allowed the rival socialist unions to gain ground. And although the CNT during the Republic remained able to mobilize a vast amount of industrial and agricultural workers, especially in Catalonia and Aragon, the organization actually saw its membership drop during the Second Republic from 300,000 in 1931 to 160,000 in 1936. You had skilled workers in Catalonia and Valencia who left the organization as part of a reformist split, and the reformers remained a minority within the organization, though as the anarchists faced the reality of the Republic with slow reforms, state repression, and the exclusion of the left, particularly after 1933. And the CNT itself was organizationally unable to actually coordinate and communicate its activities. It was organized on an industrial basis, which meant that unions in a branch of industry were brought together in a single union. Efforts to build national federations were defeated by anarchist radicals. This meant that instead of a cohesive and centralized organization, that the CNT's regional federations were virtually autonomous entities. The national leadership was elected to represent, but had no power to enforce policy or organizational directives. In the course of the strikes of the 1930s, the CNT did not even have the organizational means to communicate with its own constituent unions, which seriously inhibited their efficiency. This meant that the vast power of the anarchists was never able to be centralized or wielded effectively, since it was undone by its own anarchist decentralization. Before the war, in May 1936, there was actually an important congress of the anarchists held in Saragossa, and this ended the split with the reformists. They were brought back in, they reinformed their basic principles, such as anti-parliamentarism and libertarian communism, but they were actually more papered over than anything else. And if you actually read the documents of the Saragossa Conference, there's really no conception of a revolutionary army of any transitional phase. They reaffirm basic libertarian communism, it sounds really nice. And there was no change in the effective organization of the CNT, which would mean that, ironically, that the radical anarchists would have no integrated organizational base from which to contest the war policy with their political opponents within the Popular Front. Now, I talked about the Second Republic, which comes out from 1931. It's actually bucking the trend of the 1930s, where more authoritarian or fascist regimes are created across Europe. This is a democratic republic, but it's beset with agrarian problems, labor disputes that have been ignored and brewing for generations. There was initially, in the Second Republic, a mild left liberal government that faced opposition from a trench right wing in dealing with land reform, along with the enormous power of the Catholic Church. And these reforms were bogged down, along with the Great Depression, which had occurred, and this led to protests both on the left and on the right. In 1933, the right wing came to power. This led to a major left-wing backlash, especially when a far-right, or you can almost call it a fascist party, was invited into the government in 1934, which led to an actual abortive revolution in 1934 in October, principally in the mining regions of Spain, which actually saw the far left come together. Even though the rebellion was crushed, the far left remained energized. The right wing was essentially discredited in many respects, and following elections in February of 1936, of a coalition called the Popular Front, including everyone from the bourgeois liberals to the socialists to the communists to the Poum, actually, along with tacit anarchist support, you saw the development of a revolutionary situation with mass strikes and land seizures. You saw clashes between the far left and the far right, and Spanish and capitalists and landlords saw the country developing into chaos. And a military coup, led by General Francisco Franco, started in Morocco in July, and spread to the peninsula shortly thereafter, beginning the 3-year civil war. So let's bring the Poum up to the present, bring it up to 1936. So there were two components that would form the Poum. The first, which is the much larger one, is the Workers' and Peasants' Bloc of Joaquin Morin. Now, the Bloc considered itself communist. They were outside of the Third International, and they had an impressive array of satellite organizations, a youth wing, a women's section, electoral secretariat, defense guards. They put out their own paper, and they analyzed the Republic as follows: that they believed the Republic was not stable enough to survive, and the base for bourgeois democratic revolution in Spain was weak among the capitalists, who were not willing to challenge basic inequality in Spain, and therefore it would fall to the working class to complete the revolution. They also proclaimed national self-determination for minorities in Spain, such as in Catalonia, and colonies such as Morocco. They did not believe in collaborating with the bourgeoisie. Rather, they wanted to form their own workers' and peasants' juntas or soviets. And they hoped that by doing so, by forming these juntas or soviets, by challenging conservative power, moving society and influence toward the workers, this would complete the democratic revolution and open the way to socialism. And considering that the Bloc took the whole Catalonian section of the Communist Party with them during the split, there were actually efforts by the official Communist Party to win them back. That eventually did not work. And the Bloc, they believed that while the Republic would cause many workers to have illusions in the Republic, they want to combat this, and they hope they bring the CNT with them and to form their own revolutionary councils. The CNT refused, but they were determined the only way to have a lasting revolution would be in the streets. And this actually attracted considerable base to the Bloc, and in 2 months their membership actually doubled. There were various efforts by the Bloc to build relations with the CNT. They wanted to they formed their own opposition in the Union, in the CNT, where they wanted a more open policy. They wanted to have more influence for Bolshevik and communist ideas. But this did not work, and there were actually, but even so, the Bloc Union organization actually did win itself a base in several cities. And once the anarchist purists of the FAI gained influence over the CNT, they not only pushed away the reformers, they expelled the Bloc unions as well. And sometimes there would be stable collaboration, sometimes not. Even though the Bloc was very small, through strikes they were able to gain influence throughout the Catalan working class, and made some real dedicated interventions through various strikes. At one point, they actually led 80,000 clerical workers to victory in 1933. But there were major changes within the Bloc in 1933 following the rise of Hitler to power within Germany, when, in their view, Hitler had come to power despite the presence of the world's largest socialist and communist parties, who had remained disunited. So in May 1933, the Bloc analyzed what had happened in Germany, condemned the policy of both the socialists and the communist internationals. It demanded a union of worker forces to struggle against fascism, and for the moment to prevent it from actually gaining new influence. And out of this, they developed the Initiative of the Workers' Alliance, which was established in December of 1933, to unite the revolutionary worker and left forces against the fascist threat. And this was initially proposed in Catalonia, and it brought together the CNT, the Bloc, the Socialist Party, the Socialist Unions, the Trotskyists, and it saw major victories in various general strikes in Catalonia, in Madrid. And by late 1934, they even had brought the Communist Party in, who had initially opposed any working within the Workers' Alliance. And by September of 1934, when the Communist Party were in, this was actually the moment when the right-wing CDA had entered the government, which led to the signal for revolution across Spain. And when even though the revolution was crushed, put down in Catalonia and Madrid, the miners, led by the Alliance, represented the whole Spanish left. They actually took power for 2 weeks. They actually established their own dictatorship of the proletariat, their own Red Army. And the Republican government sent in the Foreign Legion, commanded by Franco, to put down the revolt. And despite the fighting, the workers were defeated with 2,000 dead, and at least 30,000 were herded into prison. Even though there was this massive repression, the uprising had shown the possibilities of what united action could achieve on the left. And Morin's Bloc, now with several thousand members and a strong base, principally in Catalonia, reached out for more allies to form a revolutionary party in Spain. Now this brings us to the communist left, or the Trotskyists. Now the Spanish section of the international Trotskyist movement, the communist left, was led by Andreas Nin. It was never as large as the Bloc or other leftist organizations. At its height, it had maybe 800 members. It was largely in Catalonia. It had some small groups in Madrid. Now, throughout its history, the communist left and the Trotskyist movement were very rocky. Trotsky argued that Nin and the left should develop their own international organizations and not orient themselves towards the Bloc, which he considered to be rightist and opportunistic. But Nin actually favored working within the Bloc for several reasons. First, the majority of Spanish communists in 1931 were actually outside of the Communist Party, and the formation of an independent communist grouping appeared to be a real possibility. And Nin also had known Morin personally. He recognized his theoretical and organizational skills, and so that led to a certain hope that he could win him. But even though Nin had actually tried to join the Bloc, he was actually expelled. He remained opposed. The ICE actually remained opposed to the Bloc for several years, seeing it as a separatist, opposed to class politics, and calling for the CNT to take power, which confused the role of unions in a revolution. And the Trotskyists also believed that the opportunism that characterizes the Bloc was due to its uneven relation with the Comintern and its social base. And by 1932 and 33, some things began to change. For one, the Bloc put positions which mirrored those on the Trotskyists on many levels. They condemned Comintern policy in Germany. They called for a new international. They didn't call for a fourth international, I should add. And even though the Bloc actually really did not like Trotskyism, they actually quoted Trotsky a lot in their newspapers. And perhaps most importantly, in many other respects, they moved to similar to Trotsky's positions on the Soviet Union, the Comintern, socialism in one country, etc., etc. And this kind of left Nin really feeling like we can influence the Bloc. But Trotsky was not having any of this. He had actually called in 1931 for the Spanish section to break all relations with the Bloc, and this led to a cooling of relations between Nin and Trotsky. However, there was still the growing political convergence between the two organizations. Morin and Nin, who were both Leninists, recognized the need for a vanguard party if the revolution was to succeed, and they would both work together within the Workers' Alliance. And they supported their positions had coincided in supporting calls for an all-socialist government. Their analysis on the weaknesses of the left in the Socialist Party on the national question, the Bloc moved away from its old positions, while the CNT, while the Trotskyists were moving closer to the Bloc's new positions. And they also saw the advantages of unification, since it would overcome their isolation and their lack of significant growth, and it would allow for hopefully a cohesive socialist organization to develop not only within Spain, within Catalonia, but throughout Spain. And there was eventually a break between the Trotskyists and Trotsky over the tactic of entryism, or the French turn, whereby Trotskyists were encouraged to enter the socialist parties when their base to a revolutionary line. By contrast, Nin saw that a more fruitful approach could be achieved by fusing with the Bloc. Yet, as we shall see, there was actually a real possibility of winning a significant section of the Socialist Party to revolutionary politics and building a mass revolutionary party in Spain. When Nin and Morin missed the opportunity of influencing this radicalization of the party, they ended up creating a small, however significant party limited largely to Catalonia. This effectively isolated and limited the influence of the Poum during the Civil War. Now, let's go to the Socialist Party. Now, they were not the only force who favored a unity of the far left in Spain. The Bloc and the Trotskyists were not the only force, but also the Socialist Party. And there had been radicalization within the party. They had seen the reforms of the Republic slowed and bogged down by the reformist leadership. They had seen the right wing gaining more and more influence. And this led to a radicalization, probably more verbal than actual real, from the leader of the Trade Union Federation, Largo Calabreo. But he tapped a real militant mood, particularly among the socialist youth, who were actually historically a small and reformist subsidiary of the parent party. But by 1934, they were openly proclaiming insurrection, they wanted a dictatorship of the proletariat, and they had about 200,000 members by 1934. And one of the new young socialist leftists was actually the 19-year-old General Secretary, Santiago Carrillo, who actually only died several years ago. And he led a left faction in the adult party and hoped to capture and purify the party, which would allow it to take a more revolutionary direction and base for the Socialist Party for the Trotskyists and the Bloc to influence. However, and there were even radicals within the youth who stressed their agreement with the positions of Trotskyism and the Fourth International. They condemned Stalinism and revisionism, the Communist Party. So there was actually this hope, there was actually this possibility that they could be one. And even despite the crushing of the revolution in 1934, they would still remain, their hopes became inflamed. They were still being pushed farther to the left. They kept pushing to oust the reformists. They even released a manifesto, very revolutionary. It was probably uneven from a more orthodox position of Trotskyism or left communism, or however you want to call it. But there was also real revolutionary fire there. And ultimately, the Trotskyists in Spain, the ICE, rejected any entryism into the Socialist Party. Even though Carrillo was actually reaching out to both Morin and Nin, inviting them to join the Socialist Party and fight for Marxist principles there. Morin actually probably didn't understand that the stakes of entryism, and he believed that entry into the Bloc would mean that their organization would be dissipated. And Nin, as we saw more possibilities for fusing with the Bloc. The irony of this is that Carrillo ended up joining the Communist Party, despite all the effort he had made to condemn it in 1936. And the socialist youth entered effectively by March or June of 1936. They actually fused with the communist youth to form their own unified socialist youth, which was effectively the new Communist Party youth organization. And this fusion provided the Communist Party with a much broader base, propelling its transformation to a mass party and the broader influence it would gain during the Civil War. So whatever one can say about entryism or the French turn elsewhere in the world, and there's legitimate things to be said about that, in Spain there was a real possibility for that transformation of the Socialist Party, and this would end in the failure of the ICE and the Bloc to grow into a truly mass party. It would mean they would be unable to influence events during the Civil War. The Poum itself may have had the correct ideas, but they remained isolated and unable to put their plans into action. That said, the two organizations in September 1935 unified to form the Poum. It was largely made up of blue-collar and service workers with a significant core of intellectuals and a membership of approximately 6,000. Now, it should be noted that the two organizations that formed, Morin had, compared to the Trotskyists, had about 23-1 at the time of fusion. But consider they were trying to form a unified organization, so the Trotskyists, or Nin's faction, actually had 12 of the 41 seats on the new Central Committee, which is a huge overrepresentation of their actual influence. Now, Morin would actually be captured by the Nationalists during the Civil War, which meant Nin, who had a very small base to begin with in the Poum, was catapulted into the leadership. Now, the Poum had support in Valencia and Aragon, but its center strengthened in Catalonia. It was actually the strongest socialist party in Catalonia. It had its own union federation of 60,000 members, but was dwarfed by the socialist and the anarchist federations. And it had its own program, called for things like socialist revolution, forming a vanguard party, recognition of nationalities, a dictatorship of the proletariat, all these kind of things. And in terms of their program, the Poum only actually differed from the Trotskyists on really two things. Entryism, which they rejected, and calling for a fourth international. They actually call for an international, they refused to say fourth. They're actually part of something called the London Bureau, which I think some people call the Third and a Half International. I'm not going to get into that. And they oppose entryism into the Socialist Party because they actually hoped to win over the anarchists, but they actually weren't really rather successful at that. And when the Popular Front was formed in February of 1936, they joined, even though they were critical of it. And they hoped they didn't want to be left behind with the momentum. And they actually had one candidate elected, who was Morin in Barcelona. And they hoped that the Popular Front would be a transitory step towards securing amnesty for all political prisoners and deny victory to the far right. They knew it wasn't a democratic road to socialism, but hopefully prepare the proletariat for revolution. And there was the rising expectations after the front was elected. And the Poum hoped that even though the situation was not ripe for revolution, preparations could begin. And they pressured the government to act boldly, otherwise the fascists would win. The government ignored them. And Trotsky himself was actually infuriated by the Poum's adherence to the Popular Front, saying that they, in his own words, have turned into a mere tale of the left bourgeoisie. It is hard to conceive of a more ignominious downfall. Although there would be actually a separate Trotskyist or Bolshevik-Leninist group in Spain, some of whom would actually work within the Poum, the organization was, the Poum was now effectively on its own. So this brings us to 1936 and the Spanish Revolution. And after the launching of the rebellion, Franco and his rebels received money and military aid from Germany and Italy, while the Western democracies maintained an embargo on the Republic. The Western powers hoped to contain fighting in Spain, preventing a larger European war, and to prevent aid to a revolution that threatened their class interests. Only the Soviet Union, and to a much lesser extent Mexico, provided any arms. This did not prevent, of course, workers and peasants throughout Spain from taking up arms and forming their own revolutionary organs to fight the rebels. And of course the anarchists were in charge of a great deal of this. But neither the anarchists nor any revolutionary groups overthrew the Republican government and took power on their own. The necessities of waging the war caused the anarchists to enter the Catalonian government in September and the Republican government 2 months later. And the Communist Party tried its best to create a centralized government and an army, along with attempting to gain the aid of the Western democracies. To do this, they wanted to pull back the revolution, and they found themselves trying to restore governmental power throughout the loyalist zone. And this, particularly in Barcelona, this centers of influence for the Poum and the anarchists. And this eventually led to tensions erupting in Barcelona in May, when there was an abortive uprising, and eventually the Poum would be banned, and the radical anarchists as well. I shouldn't have to actually say that any charges of the Poum actually being in league or fascist were false. And this led to a cabinet reshuffle following the May events, and the revolution effectively had come to an end at this point. Now, let's move on to the dilemmas of anarchism that they faced in this war. In the regions that fell to the hands of the nationalists, we know there was mass repression, the left was wiped out, and any influence of the Republic was effectively crushed. Now, in the Republican or Loyalist zone, the coup not only resulted in the breakdown of state authority, but into this massive revolution, centered in Catalonia, but throughout the Loyalist zone. Workers gained control of factories. In the countryside, they seized and collectivized land, and new organs of power were created to replace the old institutions, whether committees or armed militias. Now, the revolution in 1937 was being rolled back due to the necessities of the war and the reassertion of the state authority by the Republic. The question that concerns us here is why were the anarchists, who undoubtedly possessed mass support throughout Spain, unable to topple the old order and lead the revolutionary transformation of society? To answer this question, let us turn to Barcelona following the coup. The workers and soldiers had actually defeated the nationalists. They were masters of the city and the streets. They formed their new organs of power. They took control of the factories. They began this reconstruction of society. All that was needed to crown this achievement was for the anarchists to sweep away the old state power and institute their own. The old state power in Catalonia was represented by the government of President Luis Companys of the bourgeois Republican left-wing party. And Companys was actually met by the anarchist leaders of the revolution. And he had this very interesting exchange with them, where at one point he's praising them, saying that you've defeated them, the fascists in the streets, saying you've been persecuted unjustly. And he has this interesting exchange, which I'm going to quote in full. But the truth is that, although harshly persecuted up until just yesterday, today you have defeated the military and the fascists. I therefore cannot know you and the kind of people you are, use any but the most sincere language. You've won and everything is in your power. If you do not need me or do not want me to continue as the president of Catalonia, tell me now, so that I can join the ranks as one more soldier in the struggle against fascism. If, on the other hand, you believe that in this post that only death could have caused me to yield to victorious fascism, I can, with the men of my party, with my name and my prestige, be useful in this struggle, which, if it turns out so well today in the city, we do not know when or how it will end in the rest of Spain, you can count on me and my loyalty as a man and as a politician. A man who is convinced that today an entire disgraceful past has perished, and that I sincerely desire that Catalonia should march at the head of the most advanced countries with regard to social questions. All that the anarchists needed to do was to have companies step aside and establish their own power. However, this was not done. They were allowed to remain in place alongside the new popular-run organs. And according to one anarchist, Oliver, the CNT and the FAI decided on collaboration and democracy, renouncing revolutionary totalitarianism because they didn't want to establish their own anarchist dictatorship. Another anarchist said, but we did not believe in dictatorship when it was exercised against us, nor do we wish to exercise dictatorship at the expense of others. So just when power lay in their hands, they tossed it away. And the facts, of course, show that this was actually not how the revolution looked in Spain. Throughout Spain, everyone, socialists, communists, and anarchists, were exercising many of the functions of a dictatorship, a revolutionary one. And whether they were working under an anarchist banner or not, they had taken factories from capitalists, land from landowners, and they're repressing Catholic priests. I'm not shedding tears for that, or fascists and reactionaries who they believed to be in league with the enemy. Yet they refused to do the next logical step and take power. And it was impossible for the anarchists to do this without actually ceasing to be anarchists. For one thing, this is where their theory breaks down. The realities of the war, organizing and planning production, maintaining an army, developing a centralized command to fight an enemy, entailed the use of a state, especially against the better armed and organized nationalists. The anarchists had no conception of this whatsoever. At the Saragossa conference, they had envisioned libertarian communism as occurring in one act, and no conception was needed the day after the revolution. Now they're confronted with a situation in which their doctrine had ill-prepared them for. In one paper, they had actually said, after the revolution, the course now followed by the anarchist movement is full of compromises and concessions. Another article said, libertarian communism cannot be carried out immediately after the breakdown of the power of the capitalists. It presupposes a system of transitional measures in the domain of political and economic relationships, which will clear the way for active forces remolding life in the direction of our ideal. And as the necessities of war took hold, the anarchists actually found it necessary to wield state power, even if they refused to call it that. In Catalonia, they dissolved their own committees and joined the government. 2 months later, they joined the Republican government.
Yep.
And their new line was reflected in their paper when they joined the government. This does not mean simply renouncing their intention of fully realizing its ideals in the future. It simply means that in order to win the war and save our people and the world, it is necessary to collaborate with anyone in a directive organ, whether this organ be called a council or a government. Now, there was grumbling, of course, at the anarchist base over this, but they were now sharing responsibilities for the war and defending the Republic. And this would mean that they would actually be serving as peacekeepers against radicals, such as the masses of Barcelona. Now, the dilemmas of anarchism in renouncing the seizure of power are actually best expressed in this passage from a libertarian or anarchist militant. Helmut Rudiger. Those who say that the CNT should have established its own dictatorship in 1936 do not know what they are demanding. The CNT would have needed a government program, a program for exercising power. It would need a training in the exercise of power, an economic plan centrally directed, and experience in the use of the state apparatus. The CNT had none of these. Nor do those who believe that the CNT should have implanted its own dictatorship have such a program, either for their own country or for Spain. Do not let us delude ourselves. Furthermore, had it possessed such a program before 19th of July, the CNT would not have been the CT. It would have been a Bolshevik party. And had it applied such methods to the revolution, it would have dealt anarchism a mortal blow. And at this point, although the anarchists were the largest revolutionary force in Spain, they had no conception of the realities of the revolution. In renouncing leadership, they surrendered it back to the Republic. The revolution was not lost in May 1937. It had been lost in advance, in July, by the anarchists themselves. They are not prepared to be Bolsheviks, nor could they do so because their whole doctrine precluded it. They possessed no viable plan for winning the war, as we'll just see below. Those who possessed an alternative not only had a better grasp of reality, but they had the power to implement it. So this brings us to the militia. And when the army revolted with the nationalists, the uprising was actually defeated throughout most of the cities on the mainland by popularly armed militias in cities such as Barcelona and Madrid, through armed workers who actually swung the tide against the nationalists. And the CNT had militiamen numbering about 50,000. The Socialist Trade Union had about 30,000, the Communist Party 10,000, the Poum about 5,000. All the militia were poorly trained and equipped. They were organized democratically with their own members politically conscious, electing their officers and discussing orders, and no formalized chain of command existed. And that the anarchists believed that the militia was a way seen as an alternative to the old army that defended privilege and oppression, while their forces were driven by equality and liberty from authority. And this is true, they certainly were driven by revolutionary ideals. And it's true that they were not, but still, they were not going to win the war against a better armed and organized supplied nationalist force. They were not only ill-trained and lacking discipline, they were short of arms, and they often refused to follow orders. Furthermore, the militia were under the control of various political parties, which inhibited the development of a centralized command. Soldiers would leave the front without authorization. For instance, the militia were unable to stop the advance of the Foreign Legion, which moved up the peninsula towards Madrid. And militia ill-disciplined and poor coordination, that their overwhelming numbers could not break the stalemate on the Aragon front. And this is, of course, before any Soviet aid is actually involved. And as the war progressed, the Republican, to combat this, organized their own regular army with a centralized command and regular discipline. Now, before passing to both the Poum and the Communist Party, it's necessary to actually look at the position of the anarchists. And although the anarchists had supported the egalitarian ethos of the militia system and believed that winning the war is indispensable from the revolution, their own actions speak otherwise. On the one hand, as we've seen, the anarchists entered the government, which was working to restore state authority and create a centralized army. In theory, the anarchists feared that a centralized army would reconstitute the old state and the exploited system, and ultimately mean that the revolutionary zeal of the militias would be sapped. Yet, the anarchists themselves recognized the militia was not feasible. During the Battle of Madrid, the CNT issued directives that read, every militiaman shall fulfill the regulations issued by battalion committees and century and group delegates. He shall not act on his own account in matters of war and will accept without discussion any post in any place to which he is assigned both at the front and at the rear. And the defects of the militia system pushed the anarchists to accept the logic of the centralized army. Anarchist soldiers at the front, aghast at the ill discipline of the soldiers under their command, began to demand centralized and effective command. CNT units in Madrid argued for the creation of discipline in an officer corps. At the Jarama front, the CNT journal demanded the death penalty for soldiers who refused to follow orders. And this, although the CNT in many respects tried to maintain their old militia system within the People's Army, and many of their militiamen did, it's true, remain opposed to a traditional army, their overall course was one of rejecting anarchist principles in favor of a disciplined, centralized army. And this brings us to the Poum. Now the Poum was in a more ambiguous position with the outbreak of the war. Like all left parties, it grew a lot, numbering about 30,000 by the end of 1936, still centered in Catalonia. They were an advocate of workers' control and revolution. They wanted centralized popular power, and their independence from the Communist Party and the Soviet Union would make them a target. But they were not actually guided in practice by a clear revolutionary program, and they possessed an ineffective leadership, and they lacked any allies. Andras Nin had taken over the leadership of the Poum following Morin's capture. And as we've seen, the bulk of the Poum was made up of supporters of Morin, while Nin's forces were outnumbered. And Nin probably didn't possess the undoubted political skill of his comrade. And Nin's political past as a Trotskyist, and his open criticism of the Moscow show trials was making him a target. And by contrast, the anarchists actually refused from criticizing the Soviet Union, who were the main supplier of arms. And the Poum organizationally did not follow a single course. In Valencia, the party positions were virtually identical to the communists. While in Madrid, they were close to the position of Trotskyism. And this was ambiguous, reflected in the fact that while the party proclaimed anti-capitalist revolution, it had supported the Popular Front. And during the war, the Poum had called for revolutionary power, but Nin had entered the Catalonian government, along with the anarchists. And Nin was actually a critic of the anarchists' collectivization, which led to a cooling of relations between them. And the anarchists, although they knew there was conflict between both the Poum and the Communist Party, they saw no reason to get involved between two Marxist parties. And following Nin's public criticism of the Soviet Union, and at one point asking for Trotsky to have asylum in Spain, this led to Nin being forced from the government. And the Poum actually differed from the anarchists on the military question, despite what some medium have shown. While the Poum, like the anarchists, believed that the militia were filled with revolutionary fervor and zeal, and the Poum believed that there was a danger of the militia being made subordinate to the regular army and were escaping from working class control. Yet they also saw the deficits of the militia, and their solution was the same as the anarchists, a centralized army, but with one crucial caveat. They wanted a centralized red army. And this army, they said in one of their manifesto, this army must be the red army of the workers. Revolutionaries are not mercenaries. They are autonomous heroes of the proletariat revolution. Without damaging the perfect right of everyone to express his political opinion and social ideals, it is necessary to keep the strictest discipline in the military sense and to carry out to the letter all orders coming from the unified command. And this was reaffirmed in January 1937. They wanted to replace the militia system with a regular centralized red army modeled on the Soviet army, which would harness the revolutionary voluntary nature of the militias. At the same time, officers would have no privileges, but there are still democratic rights. But this ultimately meant that a red army would have to be subordinated to a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. But in order to do that, the workers would have to come to power in Spain. And that would mean that the anarchists would need to take over. And although the Poum, particularly Nin, tried to convince the anarchists to do that, that was not working. At one point, Nin was writing in the Poum paper to the anarchists, and he said, "The militants of the CNT and the FAI realize that the titanic struggle which is developing in Spain now demands important corrections. They do not dare carry these to their logical conclusion. Correction of their inverted apoliticism has led them to participate in the governmental organs, that is to say, collaboration with the bourgeois parties." And he ends it with saying, "Do they hate the term dictatorship of the proletariat? We cannot do without it." So while the anarchists showed themselves to be devoted to the cause of revolution, they never truly confronted the reality of what it would take to win. Their own lack of interest in politics and strategy did not mean those questions went away. The necessities of war forced the anarchists to violate their own principles. Yet once the anarchists made their choice to support the Republic, they never considered the Poum option for a red army. To possess no vision for strategy and victory, and while the Poum potentially at least had a vision and strategy, they lacked the means to carry it out. And this meant that as the crisis developed in Catalonia, tensions between the communists and the central government on the one hand, and the Poum and the anarchists on the other. The former wanted to restore governmental authority in the province in order to facilitate the war, and there was grumbling at the base of the anarchists and the Poumists over the high cost of living and the cost of war. along with, of course, the Soviet atmosphere of paranoia that had been imported from the Moscow show trials. So this ultimately led to a clash in May. But as I would say, the May days were far from being a revolution that missed its chance at power due to the betrayal of the communists. They were actually more a rearguard action. The Poum were not prepared for revolution. Their leadership did not want to take power. And although there was plenty of energy, and there were anarchist militants such as the Friends of Durruti, who were very radical and they were forming a united front along with the small Trotskyist group, they were not doing that. The CNT leaders called for calm, and they did not want a civil war within the civil war. This eventually led to backing down from the clashes, and it ultimately led that the Poum and was outlawed, the Friends of Durruti were outlawed, and ultimately this led to the murder of Andres Nin and effectively the end of the revolution in Spain. Now this brings us to the final part of this, the Communist Party of Spain. So if the options of both the Poum and the anarchists were non-starters, what exactly is left? Quite simply, the line of the Communist Party, which was to win the war, secure the bourgeois revolution, and form a centralized army. It is no accident that the Communist Party became hegemonic within a republic, through a viable strategy and the means to carry it out. During the war, the Communist Party went from 30,000 members in the beginning of 1936 to 200,000 by the end of 1936 and 300,000 in March of 1937. And a number of factors explained this. They were able to lead a vast social constituency throughout Republican Spain. They did have a worker core, but they also had elements of the middle classes and the peasantry. They developed links to the young radicals and the socialist youth, and the military command who wanted a disciplined army. So in Catalonia, they appealed to the peasantry and the small businesses. In the army, even if you were not an officer who was part of the Communist Party, you would see the Communist Party as an ally. And the heroic defense of Madrid and the role of both the communists and the Soviet Union in the war increased the appeal of the Communist Party. And for the government, whether it's under the initial Largo Caballero or Juan Negrin, and not without frictions, of course, the Communist Party was often a valuable ally in supporting their efforts to reconstitute authority and develop an army, and to fight until victory. And the party placed top priority on winning the war before carrying out any revolution. The communists believed that by fighting for a purely democratic revolution, that they could gain the support of the foreign powers and the supply of arms. To carry through this type of war, they did not want to antagonize the foreign powers by pushing for revolution. This meant not only scaling back the revolution, but also to not push for revolt in Franco's rear, such as in the colony of Morocco, which has been actually later criticized by supporters of the Communist Party. The Poumists wanted revolt in Morocco as well. And the Communist Party made a fatal calculation in courting Western aid by rolling back the revolution. The Western powers did not want even a reformist republic to win, but saw their class interests more closely reflected in the nationalists, who were staunch defenders of capitalism. And this was reflected not only in the two-phase neutrality policy of the Non-Intervention Committee, which the bourgeois democracies used to deny aid to all sides in Spain, including the legitimate republic. And this starved the Republic of Arms, but the Germans and Italians violated the embargo anyway. And the Soviet Union hoped that if the party and the republic pushed a more moderate course, that this would convince Britain and France to join them in collective security against the fascist threat. And this was also a miscalculation, since the Western powers were colluding with the Nazis and arguing for them to move eastward, which would become clear with the Hitler-Chamberlain Pact of Munich in 1938. And due to the arms embargo and the collusion of Western bourgeois democracies with the nationalists and the fascists, this left only one real supporter for the Republic, the Soviet Union. Beginning in October of 1936, the Soviet Union sent tanks, planes, weapons, ammunition, advisors, and through the Comintern, tens of thousands of volunteers from more than 50 countries. Soviet advisors and diplomats and Comintern representatives had to navigate a Republican landscape and deal with a fractured society, along with being caught up in the mania of the purges then taking place in Russia, which they carried over with dealing with the Poum. And the Comintern and Soviet aid was actually very crucial in helping to win the Battle of Madrid when the Republic threatened to collapse in late 1936. The nationalists had hoped by taking out Madrid with one clean blow they could end the war. That didn't happen. It was a mixture of both the Republican new centralized army being created, the revolutionary elan that came from many of the militias there, And leaving aside the international brigades, Soviet aid was not inconsequential at that battle. They had biplane fighters, about 31, which were purchased in October. Soviet T-26 tanks were used. And by November, the Republic had been provided with 132 aircraft, along with small armored cars, small arms, and ammunition and cannon. However, on top of this, there was also the moral effect of Soviet aid coming to Spain for the battle. Crowds came out to cheer the international brigades and Soviet advisors, which showed the populace that they were no longer alone. And Soviet support no doubt increased the appeal of the Communist Party. And we can see the detrimental effect of the arms embargo on the Republic clearly in a much later battle, the Battle of Ebro that took place in July of 1938. At one point, there had actually been an opening of the French border. The French kind of went back and forth on this, when some arms had actually come through. Along with these influx of arms and massive conscription, the Republic reformed an army, and they launched a major offensive against the Nationalists, hoping to push them back and to convince the Western powers that they were still a viable force who should be supported, break the embargo, give us weapons. And a lot of these were, of course, Soviet arms that were used. Of course, around this time, not only was the Hitler-Chamberlain Pact occurring, but the Nationalists were determined not to give the Republic any advantage. They pushed back the offensive, and the Republic lost a massive amount, about 75,000 casualties, most of their air force, that could not be replaced. By contrast, Franco continued to receive arms. In the end, only the Soviet Union aided the Republic with weapons for the duration of the war. And it should be added, it was for the duration of the war. There are some sources that say not, but I've actually read anti-communist sources that say they were aiding them pretty much to the end. But their supply does not match the Nationalists, it probably exceeded, their supply to the Nationalists greatly exceeded in quality and effect. They also somewhat, the assistance from the Soviet Union, and the number of German and military personnel was probably twice that of Soviet military personnel. And Italian military personnel were about 70,000. And the Germans and Italians were aided in their efforts not only by shorter supply lines, but by the willing collusion of Britain and France. The USSR was hampered not only by a much larger supply route, where they were more likely to be attacked, and their overall strategy, and of seeking rapprochement with the Western powers were probably doomed to fail. The Communist Party ultimately believed that without a centralized army, an economy geared for war in support of both the Soviet Union and the West, the Republic was likely to fall. And the goals of the party, along with their means, appealed to many disparate forces in the Republic, and battles around Madrid showed the fighting capacity of the Republic. Even the late Battle of Ebro showed that with an adequate supply, the Republic could still resist. And in order to accomplish their goals, the Communist Party is willing to roll back the revolution, not only to secure foreign aid, but to restore a working government that could organize the defense. And it's true that the Communist line was hampered by flaws, including a poor position on Morocco, infighting and purges with other parties, and a very incompetent Republican officer corps at times. And it was argued if their line could have even brought victory in the end. Yet, the Communist line was a viable option for Spain because, unlike the Anarchists and the Poum, they possessed both the means and the will to carry it out. And in conclusion, in light of the fact that neither the options of the Poum or the Anarchists were viable options, that left only the Communist Party. And the party, whatever mistakes they may have made, however non-revolutionary they were, clearly recognized that a centralized regular army was needed to the war. And in light of everyone, they possessed both the means and the will to put their plans into action, unlike other forces. Thank you. Questions, comments, concerns, polemics? I know I'm going to get those. In the back.
What was the historiography of the Spanish Civil War in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe under Khrushchev and Brezhnev afterwards? As I understand, anyone who, in the Eastern Bloc, who was in Spain at that time was way marginalized or had their careers ruined, like it was a major embarrassment to them?
In terms of I'll answer the second part of that first. A lot of international brigaders like Tito was an international brigader. A lot of the leaders of the new people's democracies in Eastern Europe were international brigaders. A lot of them were purged. They were seen as possible independent forces. Soviet historiography, which I haven't read too much of, they do highlight the aid of the international brigades, Soviet aid. A lot of the stuff with the purges does not get discussed for obvious reasons. although later on pro-Soviet parties would pretty much criticize that. Like Kirillo later in life, when he becomes a Euro-communist, actually says, Nin was not a traitor. We were wrong to kill him. Essentially, like that, he doesn't quite come out and say we're wrong to kill him, but he's saying like this is a bit. But anyway, the Soviet they were it would be highlighted more as part of an anti-fascist struggle. Any other comments, concerns, objections, polemics?
Really?
I talk about like the crunch at it, Yes,
Well,
Joe.
I was going to wait. I
Go
talk
ahead.
a lot, but now nobody has their hand up.
You got your hand up, you can go.
Well, the most, how would you, see when you talk about anarchist leaders, the anarchists get upset, all right? But we'll say the most prominent anarchists joined the government, like you said. But they did resign certain positions within their milieu to make it look like the anarchists were joining the government when they really were. So that's a nuance that people should be aware of. Also, it seems history bears out without an adequate preparatory period and the consolidation of a force that can lead workers and peasants to power. You run into all these splits and factions and defeats. You saw it in Germany at the end of World War I. They didn't have time to put together an organization. As well in Spain, there wasn't an organization that had sort of a tradition of Leninist politics with any kind of strong continuity. If you look at it sort of from a 30,000-foot view, looking down on it, but I think the intricacies of what you're saying are extremely important to really understand the internal processes that were going on. That's critical. I'm of the view that they couldn't really win the Civil War without making a revolution. I think even in Orwell's book he talks about that somewhat in Homage to Catalonia, that in order to consolidate the united support of the workers and the peasants in a centralized army, the revolution, they weren't going to die for this program that would eventually defeat and undermine the unions and collaborate with France or the Western powers or whatever. I don't think they could have won without actually making the revolution. It would be a process, a unified process is the concept I have. The only shot at winning at that point resided with the government and the Communist Party. I'll go along with that. Because, by some fluke of history, the Communist Party could have won. Let's say there was internal fighting amongst Franco, he was assassinated or something. There are possibilities there, not good ones. But overall, in the years preceding the Civil War and going into the Civil War, it seems to me that the only way they could have won was to deepen and consolidate the revolution, actually, the seizure, which was already going on in Catalonia. But to just say what the Communist Party said, well, we're not going to go all the way with this. We're going to keep these the bourgeoisie in power. You couldn't win a civil war that way. That's at least the way I see it. That they weren't willing to die, in the long run for a bourgeois reforms.
All I'm saying is that may have been true, but who was going to do it?
Yeah.
I'm trying to tell you why it wasn't done.
That's
The
right.
Poum, I look at the program because the more I kept reading about this militia system just does not work, and the more I kept reading the sources, it's like, oh, neither did anyone else really think it worked. So the Poum actually had. Orwell puts the false dichotomy, I think, between militias and the centralized army, when the Poum position, which he was a part of the Poum militia, was actually the centralized Red Army. But the Poum, as I said, they didn't have the alliances or the influence, and they were too isolated.
Yeah.
The anarchists were not thinking about power, at least not as I would think Marxists would think about power. They're not going to do that. So that means if those are non-starters, you have a different option. Now, if the Communist Party was not pursuing that, some other force probably would have.
Mm-hmm.
So
You're right about that.
So that you may have all been right, but I'm just trying to say it's like if you're gonna look at how you can actually win, I think the key mistakes were made in what the Poum did before the war. Now even if they had done everything right, if they rolled, if they got lucky sevens the whole time, it still would have been an uphill battle for them. That doesn't mean they would have won. They would have been in a better position before the war, or going into it. And if the anarchists had decided to take power, that would have been different. But I don't see. Every time I read it, it's like, no, they're not going to take power. That's against their whole conception of how to do things.
Well, you do have to know all the details,
Yeah.
like you outlined. I mean,
And I know it was too
people
long.
that agree with me don't give a shit about the details. All right, they just say, well, they didn't want to make a revolution, so therefore they're going to lose. And if you're not really in touch and bound up and involved in the details, you're never going to have a clue about what to do.
Sure. In the back.
Thank you, Doug. That was an awesome, informative talk. I'd like to welcome a lot of new faces at the Center for Marxist Education. I'd like to ask Doug to pass around we ask people to make a contribution if they can, because we have no corporate sponsors. So anything helps, and we also got a sign-up list if people want to get on our email announcement list. I know what's going on there.
And feel free to like us on Facebook, Center for Marxist Education as well. Any other questions, comments, objections? Yes.
Is there a Poum organization still existing in Spain?
I actually was talking to someone about this. The Poum, they existed after 1937. I'm just not going into it. Some of them were underground, and some of them lived in exile. Some former members wrote histories of it, which I relied on. And they lasted at least up until 1980, when I believe they dissolved. And there's something called like the Andres Nin Foundation, which exists. I don't think that's not like a party; it's just like a foundation. But a lot of the some members, maintained some kind of Marxist politics. A lot of them moved into like this Cold War, left-wing, social democracy thing. But they did last through, at least through the Franco era until like at least 1980. But they did not maintain the type of organizational structure the Communist Party did during the underground years. They came out, pretty much intact, after 75.
Yeah.
Yes?
So ultimately, with the CP, why did it ultimately lose? What mistake did they make? They said they had the will, they had material.
I think the arms embargo.
The arms embargo. So you think it was a lack of material support that led to the defeat, ultimately, why the Communist Party couldn't set up a liberal bourgeois?
I think that's a huge factor. If the Poum or the anarchists had taken power, all of those problems would still be there. You'd still have the fact that you do not have a steady support of arms and material. Spain was not a very industrialized country. Mm-hmm. You would have had to somehow, and in practice, the anarchists were refraining from criticisms of the Soviet Union to secure arms, because they did not want to antagonize them. Mm-hmm. That reality would have existed. Again, I think if different forces had been in power, of course, different policies would have been pursued, but a lot of the same problems would have remained. That's what I'm saying.
The other point of view I was going to suggest would be because you had mentioned the membership of the Communist Party, and I've read something about the numbers of it, and it's been categorized. The way I saw it was categorized. They had like workers, industrial workers, peasants, intellectuals, small business, and that kind of stuff. The working class was, I think you alluded to this, was a significant portion of it, but cumulatively was not the majority. You know what I mean?
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Do you think that orienting towards sort of liberal bourgeoisie undercut their support in the working class?
To a certain extent, maybe. But the thing is, like, in practice, a lot of organizations were also doing that.
Yeah. Just the point that I was making is that by orienting towards people who have a strong interest in maintaining private property rights, and also then therefore have an interest in seeing fascism win, because fascism will definitely protect those, property rights, but the Communist Party has to go convincing people that they're not going to attack it, which, ultimately.
every party made mistakes in Spain, and I'm not going to absolve the Communist Party of their legitimate mistakes. There were real pitfalls in their strategy they pursued. They could have pursued a different strategy, but they had said in advance, we're not going to do that. So, the Popular Front had been predicated, we're not going to do that. And I can play like what ifs forever on this, so I'm not going to quite do that. But if the Poum or the Anarchists had somehow formed it, they would have had to deal with these different social forces. How they deal with that, I couldn't say. They would have had to either form alliances, isolate them, try and just keep it neutral. But it would also have been difficult in the midst of, while you're fighting like a much heavily armed force, to suddenly start expropriating everybody at the same time. It would have been a major disorganization of production. Now theoretically, of course, you can reconstitute production, but you would have still had that disorganizational problem, and you would have had the fact that you would have been potentially even more isolated from potential armed supporters.
Final what if though?
Sure.
Suppose the revolution does successfully take place in Spain. Does that instigate a political revolution in the Soviet Union?
Probably not.
You don't think so?
No, considering the power of the Soviet state, army, and party, no.
I mean, that was always true, but an example, you know what I mean?
I mean, if you're talking about any Trotskyist forces which did exist in the Soviet Union, were very small, very isolated, and largely confined to prisons. So, I'm just saying.
Just putting it out there.
I think what you could have potentially seen, the Soviet Union, that's a little far-fetched. You could have definitely seen ripple effects in probably Italy and Germany. Because Italy had a very strong, actually Italy and Germany still had underground communist parties. When I did the talk on communist resistance in Nazi Germany, there were Germans who refused to deliver arms to the nationalists. That didn't end well for them, but they did exist, these underground apparatuses, and a defeat for fascism like that could have potentially disrupted the state structures and the military there, and could have led to maybe delayed World War II, maybe led to their downfall. But again, this is a what if, so I can't actually tell you what's going to happen in a what if scenario.
So Communist Party is clearly getting aid from the Soviet Union. What was the Poum and Anarchists getting their material aid from?
They did control factories, and they did pick up whatever weapons they could,
Okay.
but they were told.
Adding to what Tim was saying, there's a theory that if the Spanish Revolution had succeeded, the Second World War could have played out in a completely different context. It
Sure.
could have been a clash with France, the Popular Front. France several times was on the brink of revolution, several times in the mid to late 30s.
Yeah.
But the Second World War could have played out as a class war instead of a war between rival bourgeois empires. History would have been dramatically different.
I mean, one thing, first of all, the war actually ends in late March of 1939. And World War II breaks out in September of 1939. So you have like this 5-6 month time span. And at various points, the Republic wanted to last until the war broke out, which didn't happen. And even the Communist Party they were actually condemned by various factions in the Republican government for pushing for all-out resistance to the very end. I mean, how the war would have played out if the Spanish Republic was there, I can't tell you. There's all kinds of different factors. It is the butterfly effect. You don't know what those unintended outcomes of that are going to be.
But if there had been a workers' revolution in Spain, my guess is it would have also affected Portugal, both on the Iberian Peninsula.
Yes, we were allied with Franco.
Yeah, no,
Away in the back.
yeah. Could you discuss a bit the opposition to Roosevelt's arms embargo?
Opposition to Roosevelt's arm embargo
I'm
did.
talking about here in the United States.
Yes, in the United States, came from the Communist Party. It came from liberal intellectuals. Even some left New Dealers did oppose the arms embargo. But there was also, Roosevelt was also dealing with a very conservative Catholic vote, here, who, a lot of whom did support Franco, along with business interests who were willing to violate that. But the U.S. was still very much isolationist. And even though, yes, there were the international brigades to go to Spain, you didn't see it quite. The intensity here was not quite, I would say, what it was in, say, France, where the Spanish question brought down the government at one point, or like the whole questions related to war and fascism. So, I mean, there was opposition here to it. There were polls, I believe a majority of people did not support the embargo, but the Roosevelt administration was not willing to do anything. I think in retrospect, they actually, I'm not sure if it was Roosevelt or one of his cabinet secretaries said, we made a mistake there, but they were not willing to do anything about the policy. Yes?
Yeah, no, just in reference to what you were saying, Sandy, about the country right next to Spain, which is Portugal.
Right.
I was just wondering if you knew anything about how if there was organized opposition to Franco in Portugal, because I've heard, I had a friend when I worked in Brockton who said that they were in the factories, the armaments factories in Portugal. They would deliberately make sure that those bombs that were being given to the nationalists would not work. They would just be duds. They would sabotage it. All right, and they'd send little notes saying, this, thank you. We want to support the Republic. Compliments Portuguese Communist Party, something like that. So
I mean,
it was solidarity.
Yes, there was that type of solidarity.
Yeah.
And initially, if you actually look at a map, which I don't have, Portugal also did provide a bridge because the nationalist zones were disconnected. So
Yeah.
Franco's troops could pass between them
Yeah.
to their disconnected territories. Once, after a few months, that bridge wasn't quite as necessary. But Portugal was not a huge supporter of arms to Franco, not compared to the other fascist powers.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And yes, you're right, there was underground opposition to Portugal, and unlike actually Spain, Portugal's fascism was actually overthrown in an internal revolution.
That's right. The generals.
Yeah,
in 74.
in 74.
Yeah.
But the Salazar dictatorship was fairly new. I think it had been created in 1930 or 32,
Yeah.
and it was still consolidating power. What didn't quite have this, I mean, it certainly wasn't pleasant, but it didn't have the same viciousness and genocidal intent that you found under Franco. They saw, like, the areas they conquered as colonies. They were fascist officers in Spain who's like, we shouldn't have given the workers sewage. It allowed, clean sanitation allowed them to reproduce and rise up against us. It's like this, like almost medieval in like their conception of how they're looking at these people.
Very ideological. Yeah.
But yeah, there was solidarity, but I don't think there was like an huge organized resistance force in
Yeah.
Portugal.
Right, yeah.
Surprised I haven't been condemned yet. Anything else?
Just tangentially,
Sure.
Portugal in '74, with the generals, talking about proletarian revolution and everything. Basically, what they did is they maintained Portugal for the bourgeoisie.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Carnation Revolution is a huge topic, really interesting, but I'm not going to get into the Carnation Revolution here. Way in the back. Yep, you, Caitlin. Yep.
Oh, yeah, my understanding is Leon Blum, who was the socialist president
Yes.
of France, also had a very strict arms embargo against the aid to the Spanish Republic.
That's true.
And they really viciously cracked down on anyone who tried to help Spain.
Okay, initially Blum, who was actually part of the leader of the French Popular Front, which was elected around the same time as the Spanish one, initially did allow arms. But there was so much opposition from the far right, the people who said better Hitler than a Jew, because Blum was a Jew, opposed the arms embargo, and all this kind of tensions eventually led to Blum's downfall. He would come back into government various times, and because there was a fear in France also had seen a vast upsurge of the far right in the 30s. The same people who would be running Vichy and would be making sure to punish the Popular Front for French decadence, through concentration camps and willingly collaborating with the Germans. But Blum personally was opposed to the embargo, but he was part of a coalition government that had various fissures and was not very stable. The communists certainly wanted no embargo. They wanted arms to flow, and at least 10,000 French people went to Spain as volunteers. And the French border was like there were smugglers going through it, and some French police officers looked the other way, some were more enforcing it, but anything else? Okay, before I finish, next month we go to Germany, the German Revolution, which is from after World War I. This is the prequel to the communist resistance one. Then we go to Spartacus in March, like the ancient Rome. Never do the actual modern Spartacus that you just But thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
The essay of this will be published hopefully next week, because I wrote more an essay as opposed to a lecture, which is my fault.
Thank you.
But so thanks for coming, and hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.